We continue with part, with which it will be convenient to debate Clause 17 Stamp Part, Schedule 1 Stamp Part and Clause 18 Stamp Part. The question is that Clause 16 Stamp Part of the Bill. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Crosbie. Clauses 16, 17 and 18 implement the Smith Commission by devolving fully two taxes, air passenger duty and the Aggregates Levy. These taxes will be switched off in Scotland, and the Scottish Parliament will have full competence to maintain, redesign or scrap them. The changes made by clauses 16 and 18 will switch off APD in Scotland and give the Scottish Government the power to charge its own tax on passengers departing from Scottish airports. The Scottish Government will be free to make its own arrangements with regard to the design and collection of any replacement tax. Alongside this, funding for the Scottish Government will be reduced by an amount equivalent to the level of APD that would have been raised in Scotland. Clauses 17, 18 and Schedule 1 make changes to ensure that the UK Aggregates Levy can be fully devolved in Scotland. The Smith Commission agreement stated that there would be full devolution of the levy to Scotland following resolution of the legal challenges against the levy. The changes made by Clause 17 will give the Scottish Parliament the power to charge a tax on the commercial exploitation of aggregate. The use of Schedule 1, and together they enable the existing UK levy to be disapplied in Scotland. These provisions allow the Scottish Government freedom in the design and implementation of any tax on the commercial exploitation of aggregate in Scotland. I beg to move that clauses 16, 17, 18 and the schedule stand part of the bill.
Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Mr Crosbie. I moved Amendment 36, which is essentially to oppose the clause stand part debate, because I wanted the House to explore both the specific issues related to air passenger duty and the more general principles about tax competition between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom, as may well evolve from a discussion on air passenger duty. I think, just as general background, that those of us who voted to set up the Scottish Parliament in the first place, which seemed a very bold decision at the time, now think it is less bold than it might have been, and that if we had the benefit of being able to go back in time, and we've got the benefit of hindsight, that actually the proposals that the government are making now might well have been the proposals that should have been put before the House after the 97 general election, and we should be moving to full fiscal autonomy for the Scottish Parliament now. I think it was a fundamental mistake to effectively set up a Scottish Parliament with mainly spending powers and not tax-raising powers, apart from the plus or minus three pence on income tax. So I have no... Of course.
Here, listening to what the Honourable Gentleman said, he's absolutely right, and isn't one of the mistakes there that there is no incentive for the Scottish Government to grow the economy. One of the great examples we have in the Hebrides is the Scottish Government has put in road equivalent tariff into the ferries. This has grown the economy in the west of Scotland, but the increase in tax revenue is not going to the government that funds this. It's going to Westminster, that gives no extra cash and further incentives to roll this out further across the West Coast, similarly with childcare and a number of other issues.
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a pretty fundamental point about devolution. I think when the House is making a decision to devolve powers, it would have been sensible to set up a grant basis that was fair between Scotland and Wales, of which the Barnett formula was not, and then allow the Scottish Parliament to raise taxes, so that on that basis, if they wanted better quality of service, they could have had higher taxes. If they were more efficient, they could have had either better services or lower taxes, and so on. I think that's a very clear principle. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful again to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, but the important point I'm driving at is that if the Scottish Government had proper control of its taxes, it could have grown the economy more. And the growth would have delivered far more than the zero-sum game of who's got what in the UK and who's not got this and who's got the next bit or whatever. It's the ability to grow the economy that taxpayers would give that's really fundamental here.
If the honourable gentleman is saying that Scotland or any other devolved authority should benefit from the initiatives it takes and from its own efficiencies, then I agree with him completely if that is the point. We're moving that way. I don't think in this bill we're moving far enough. No minister or shadow minister has been able to explain to me why we should have an unfair funding formula in the Barnett formula in any of the debates that we've had. But I think those are the basic principles. But what I want to explore with the government, where taxation is devolved to the Scottish Parliament, how the United Kingdom government is going to respond to competition. And I think that air passenger duty is a very good example to take. As I understand it, the SNP are going to, it's their intention to reduce air passenger duty by 50% and then reduce it to zero. And I think that actually is quite a sensible policy for the SNP to follow, and for that matter for the United Kingdom government to follow, because there have been a number of consultants' reports that have shown that there is almost certainly likely to be a benefit for the whole of the United Kingdom if air passenger duty was taken off. And many other countries, in fact I think all of the countries in the European Union have either moved to very low rates of air passenger duty, or as in the case of the Netherlands, to zero. So I think it's a sensible policy, but what I want to hear from the government, who don't seem to have a clear position on what will be very unfair competition with the regional airports, what they will do. I will give way again.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. He's mentioned air passenger duty. I think it's a perfect illustration of what I was saying earlier, that if the Scottish Government decides it wants lower air passenger duty and that ups the rate of economic activity in Scotland, they should benefit from the fruits of that activity, and it shouldn't go to Westminster, who then wouldn't compensate them for that initiative.
Yeah. If the honourable gentleman just listens to the quote I'm going to give from the Chancellor of the Exchequer speaking to the Treasury Select Committee on the 20th of January this year to a question from my honourable friend from Wythenshawe and Sale East about this very point. He said, "I think the best approach to dealing with this concern, which I think is perfectly legitimate, is to work across the political boundaries of our two parties to find a solution that helps these regional airports that could be affected by an air passenger duty decision north of the border. I mean, the HMRC has actually done some work on this, and I think it anticipated that Manchester Airport would lose around 3% of its traffic and Newcastle could lose around 10% of its traffic. That was work carried out a couple of years ago. I think you and I make the same offer to Ed Balls, can work to try and find a solution that helps regional airports in the north of England if the Scottish Government were to go down the road of dramatically cutting its air passenger duty." And further than that, the Chancellor told the House of Commons on the 27th of January, "We have a couple of years to work this out, and it does not have to be done tonight or tomorrow, and we can work out a plan that protects the brilliant Newcastle, Manchester and other regional airports." And I want to hear from the Minister what progress has been made on that, because this is not the 3% and the 10% loss of business are not trivial amounts. There will not only be economic benefit from Scotland, but there will be real competition, and it will come in two forms, really. There will be competition for passengers on short-haul flights, leaving it's £13 a passenger, and on longer haul flight it's £71 a passenger. Obviously that doubles coming back. So there is an incentive for a passenger in Newcastle to travel to Edinburgh or to Glasgow to save some money, particularly for a large family. There is the same incentive, actually, for somebody coming from long distance from North America or from China to try to find... Of course I give way.
A great follow-on friend. Could I also argue, one friend, would you agree with me that it has a knock-on effect on cargo as well? Because if flights, for example, we have a very successful flight from Newcastle to Dubai, if that was to be jeopardised anyway, the revenue which is earned from the airport through transport of cargo in that passenger aircraft would also be at risk.
I agree with my honourable friend, because there are competitions for passengers, as I have just said, but there is also competition to get airlines and aircraft to land, and as a lot of cargo is carried in the belly of aeroplanes, then if you lose a flight from Newcastle or Manchester or Leeds Bradford to Scotland, then you not only lose the passengers and the benefit of that, you also lose the cargo that's carried in that plane. We have experience of this within the United Kingdom already. Belfast Airport managed to get, or the Northern Ireland Assembly managed to get the power to vary air passenger duty because it was receiving competition from Dublin Airport, who were taking passengers and aircraft south of the border to travel from Dublin. I think those people who are interested in transport, that's well known. What is less well known is that there wasn't only an impact on Belfast, but there was also an impact on English and Welsh airports as people made the decision to fly across the Atlantic and save the £71 from Dublin. I mean, I'll just, before I draw my remarks to a conclusion in terms of economic impact in England, I've given the figures for the actual savings that passengers could make, and of course airlines can split that between the passenger and their own profit line to take advantage of it. But if at Manchester Airport one Ryanair flight and one EasyJet flight is moved to, for the sake of argument, to Glasgow, that's 2.9 million lost revenue to the United Kingdom Treasury and 450 jobs lost in Manchester. That's not insignificant when one is trying to build an economy, and I don't blame Edinburgh or Glasgow for trying to build their economy in the way that Newcastle and Manchester will do. Those figures represent nearly 250,000 passengers, and the economic impact, if you get onto long haul, is much more significant. I'm happy to give it.
Well, notwithstanding the points, thank you very much for allowing me to kind of, notwithstanding the point about the cross-border competition that you're making, would you also agree, though, that there is another point about the longer-term sustainability of airports that are out with that area, such as Inverness and Dundee, which need the additional support and would benefit from the revenue that's being generated by additional passenger traffic being reinvested into Scotland?
Yeah, that's a perfectly sensible point to make, and I agree with that. There are a number of things that the government may have, and I hope the Minister is able to respond in some way. Manchester Airport have made the case strongly to the government that there should be an air passenger duty holiday on new long-haul routes. That would be helpful. They could devolve the decision-making to other parts of the United Kingdom as well as to Scotland, although the mechanism for that would be difficult. Or they could agree to compete with Scotland, because if that competition isn't there, then there will be an unfair loss of jobs by lowering the rate of air passenger duty, which to me, given the experience in the rest of Europe, indeed in the rest of the world, this is a tax that was brought in not for environmental reasons, as is sometimes said, but entirely to deal with the hole in the budget after the 92 general election. It's an inefficient tax. The estimates that have been made by consultants is it costs the economy more than it brings into the Treasury in cash. And I hope the Minister, even if he can't give an absolutely definitive answer today, will be able to assure us that he is willing to look at some of those sensible responses to this new competition in tax regimes. I'll give way for the last time.
I'm very grateful, Honourable Members. He has been very kind. It's more, I think, than just the hole in the budget. It's actually a demand management tool for Heathrow and perhaps Gatwick as well. The airports are full. They've got this demand management tool which might work in that area. It's certainly not helping in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Manchester. And the solution is not to worry about each other. The solution is for us to be rid of it and for them to keep the demand management tool in the airports that are already saturated.
So, on the honourable gentleman's fourth intervention, I don't agree with him on that point. I think that demand management is not the solution to regional airports. There's huge extra capacity in our regional airports. But if I went down that line, Mr Crosbie, I suspect you might rule me out of order. I look forward to the Minister's response.
Stuart Halsey.
Thank you, Mr Crosbie. Can I turn to the clause stand part debate, and I'll come to some of the other comments in relation to the honourable gentleman later. The provisions relating to the devolution of air passenger duty, and I will, Mr Crosbie, concentrate mainly on that rather than aggregates levy or the further provisions in clause 18. The provisions relating to the devolution of APD were clearly set out in the Smith Agreement. The power to charge tax on air passengers leaving Scottish airports will be devolved, and the Scottish Government will be free to make its own arrangements with regard to the design and collection of any tax, including consideration of any environmental impact. In line with the approach taken in the 2012 Act, if a tax is introduced by the Scottish Parliament to replace APD, the Scottish Government will reimburse the UK Government for any costs incurred in switching off APD in Scotland. Although, given they simply won't collect it, I don't imagine those costs would be very high. There will also require to be a fair and equitable share of associated administrative costs and will be transferred to the Scottish Government as well, along with the block grant being adjusted. Now, a wide range of organisations gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament Devolution Committee, and they backed the devolution of APD, including the Institute of Directors, Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, the Scottish Chamber, Scottish Council for Development and Industry, and as the committee's report said, that was coupled with support for either a reduction or scrapping of the duty after devolution had taken place. And the Scottish Parliament Information Centre analysis for the committee referred in its report to the draft clause 14, now clause 16, would make this a devolved tax as recommended by the Smith Commission. It would give the revenue the ability to switch off those UK taxes in Scotland from a date to be set by secondary legislation. Now again, as with many of the other clauses we've discussed, there's no recommendation on the transfer, how that will work, or indeed how it will see the block grant adjusted. But as I've understood from other clauses, there's no requirement for legislation to achieve that. Essentially then, the legislation delivers on the Smith Agreement in the way anticipated, and we've no concerns with the drafting of the clause, which did not change between the command paper version and the Scotland Bill. Now, in terms of the policy approach on APD, because that's where much of this clause stand part debate is centred, we support the devolution of air passenger duty to the Scottish Parliament. We're pleased that the Scotland Bill will deliver this recommendation, and we have set out previously our proposals to half APD when control is devolved, and we fully intend to abolish it when public finances allow. We believe taking that action will encourage greater tourism and investment in Scotland, boosting our economy and creating new jobs. There are a substantial number of benefits of air passenger duty reduction for consumers, not least because the UK levies some of the highest aviation taxes in the world, and indeed APD is relatively rare in other countries. Currently £71 for an economy class long-haul flight, which is extraordinary. That's over £2,000 a ticket. So abolishing APD would mean a family of 4 where the children are over 12 would save something under £300 per long-haul flight, a substantial saving by any measure. So reducing air passenger duty will therefore save consumers money, and in certain circumstances it could significantly reduce the cost of family holidays. There are broader economic benefits also from air passenger duty reduction. The report commissioned by Edinburgh Airport in March this year found the reduction in APD would bring considerable economic benefits to Scotland. It argued that the Scottish Government's policy of halving APD in the first instance would create new jobs, and that a failure to take action would cost Scotland tourists and tourist revenue. The key findings included a 50% reduction would provide benefits to Scotland worth over £200 million a year, meaning a £1 billion economic boost over the lifetime of a Parliament. A 50% reduction would bring considerable benefits to local communities, creating something in the order of 3,800 new jobs by 2020. On the other hand, it was estimated we could lose out on somewhere around 1 million passenger journeys a year if APD was not reduced, and again by 2020 that would cost the Scottish economy up to £68 million in lost tourism expenditure every year. So that it's clear that devolving and then reducing APD will lead to considerable economic impact for Scotland, and that failure to act will mean Scotland misses out on significant tourism and hospitality revenue. Now, we've heard the study and the example from what happened in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And although the 2014 study by Ulster University was a little more ambivalent and suggested there were only a limited number of scenarios where Northern Ireland might benefit, the supporters of a reduction pointed out to the success of this approach in the Republic. As the BBC reported, Tourism Northern Ireland Chair Howard Hastings saying, if you compare with our nearest neighbour in the Republic, in the 2 years since they abolished air passenger duty, they've seen arrivals grow by 1.1 million passengers. Self-evidently a success, and if we can replicate that, and then we can deliver the benefits I've described. If we don't, then we may have the cost of failure in that regard. Now, the honourable gentleman, and I know others have tabled amendments which aren't being debated, although the debate was very similar to the one I thought I might have heard had we been debating the amendment. And they have expressed concern that the devolution of APD to Scotland would disadvantage airports in the north of England as travellers journey across the border to Scottish airports in order to travel to holiday destinations abroad. Can I say, Mr Crosbie, the SNP makes no apologies for championing Scotland, and we do believe that the reduction and eventual abolition of APD would benefit Scotland's economy and the tourism sector in particular. There is also a cross-party commitment agreed through the Smith Commission to devolve this. Indeed, attracting more tourists to Scottish airports by reduced APD could also benefit the north of England, therefore rebalancing the economy from London's pool and bringing more visitors into the northern parts of these islands as a whole. And if one considers Edinburgh to be a hub airport, I'm sure businesses in the north of England would rather spend an hour on the train from Newcastle to Edinburgh rather than the 4 or 5 on the cross-London journey to get to Heathrow, let alone going to a hub in Schiphol or Charles de Gaulle. So Edinburgh is the ideal solution for people from Durham. A stronger Scottish economy will also bring significant economic benefits to the north of England as new trade and investment opportunities arise. However, we are concerned about some of the UK Government's threats in relation to APD, and this actually relates to what the honourable gentleman said about competition. During the election, the Prime Minister, rather astonishingly, expressed concerns that a reduction in APD would distort competition. He said the SNP government in Scotland is committed to using new powers to cut and eventually abolish air passenger duty from flights from Scottish airports. That could distort competition and see businesses drawn north of the border and huge impact on airports in the rest of the country. So we are reviewing the way in which air passenger duty works to make sure other cities don't lose out. Mr Crosbie, devolving APD where the Scottish Government might seek to amend it is not a distortion of competition. It is competition. The Prime Minister comments also chime with his so-called Carlisle principle, which was reported as follows. The Prime Minister has outlined plans for an annual review of the impact of Scottish devolution on the rest of the UK. He announced what he's calling the Carlisle principle in Crewe. One could have thought he'd have gone to Carlisle to do it, but Crewe it was. He said the aim was to make sure that policies that devolve more power to Scotland don't have a negative impact on other parts of the UK. In areas like air passenger duty, tax rates, university tuition fees or energy policy. If only we'd thought about that, we wouldn't have abolished the subsidies for onshore wind. He said, I want to set out a new principle. You could call it the Carlisle principle, that we will make sure there are no unforeseen detrimental consequences to the rest of the country from Scottish devolution for either England, Wales or Northern Ireland. So perhaps the Minister can explain if the Carlisle principle, whatever it actually is, it will mean in practice for the devolution of APD. And I hope when he gets up he will say precisely nothing. There is agreement on all sides that we have a no detriment and a no advantage principle agreed before the Smith proposals were published. They are clearly being adhered to. There is all-party agreement on the devolution of APD. There can be no backsliding. I suspect there will be no votes on this, and I look forward to what the Minister says in summing up.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Mr Corsman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I start by saying that I do not oppose the devolution of APD to the Scottish Parliament, but it does, as my honourable friend for Blakely and Broughton said, has a dramatic effect on those regional airports within the UK. Now, in terms of what the member for Dundee East said about the attractions of North East business wanting to travel to Edinburgh to fly internationally, I've got to say they sooner fly to Newcastle direct. And in terms of the notion that somehow people are going to fly to Edinburgh and then get on a train south to our region is not going to be as alternative than flying directly into the North East into Newcastle. Now, Newcastle has been a success story for the North East. Now, we hear much from this government about rebalancing the economy, and it's the North East that's taken the brunt in terms of not only the loss of public sector jobs, but also as the highest unemployment in the UK, and also is on a knock-on effect by some of the decisions of this government in terms of devolving or diverting deliberately funds from poorer regions such as the North East to its Tory heartlands. Now, in terms of the rhetoric we've heard from the government about trying to grow the private sector, the Newcastle Airport, I think, has been a great example of that. I had the privilege of being, quite a few years ago, a director of the airport, and it's a great partnership between the local authorities in the region and the private sector. Now, in 2012, it added value of some 640 million to the North East Company. By its master plan by 2030, it will generate some £1.3 billion for the North East economy, sustaining at present some 7,800 jobs, rising to over 10,000 by 2030. Now, in terms of the routes which have been developed by the team at Newcastle, we have direct flights now to Dubai and internationally to New York. And they will be put at risk if we have a situation whereby the Scottish Government go ahead with its plans, and I don't say if it is devolved, and I understand the reasons why they want to reduce air passenger duty, because it's quite clear that, as my honourable friend for Blakely and Broughton said, is that it was a tax brought in for environmental reasons, which actually now makes very little common sense in terms of growing the economy of this country. So in terms of the aspirations that the Scottish Government have in terms of wanting to half
I'm slightly puzzled now. It could be I'm reading the order paper wrong, but would I be wrong to interpret your amendment, which hasn't been called for debate, as seeking to delete the clause which would have devolved their passenger duty? Now, several times the honourable member has said he's not opposed to the devolution of air passenger duty. It does seem the amendment was going to delete it from devolution.
Well, the reason for that was the advice given to get the Probing Amendment. There's no intention of actually deleting it. It was actually to get on the order. It wasn't selected. That's the reason why. I thought the honourable gentleman, his experience in the House would have been quite au fait with the procedures of making sure you get a debate on a subject on the floor of the House in terms of this. But in terms of the proposals put forward by the Scottish Government, it does make economic sense, because by reducing the air passenger duty, which they want to do and abolish it, it will clearly grow airport traffic into airports in Scotland and clearly grow jobs. That will be, though, at the detriment of airports such as Newcastle. Now that
to the honourable gentleman giving way. If he's concerned that further devolution to Scotland might make Scotland too successful, surely the answer to that is to see further devolution to the regions of England and to the great cities of England as well, not to stop further devolution in its tracks so that we remain centred in London forever and a day.
Oh, I don't disagree, but what this government has put forward for the North East is a very, well, it's not very clear. You have an elected mayor which stretches down from Berwick right down to the Tees, and that's the only way we're actually going to get any type of devolution to the North East at all, without any public debate which goes on. But I don't disagree with the honourable gentleman's thrust. But in terms of air passenger duty, it will grow clearly jobs in those Scottish airports, and it's not just, I accept this, that I can't remember who made the point earlier on about some of the more outlying airports, because we do have a policy in this country of looking at regional airports just as the major city airports. But it's quite clear within the UK there are some small airports and communities which do need the connectivity from their areas to those major hubs, whether it be both in the UK or in Scotland.
The honourable gentleman. Yeah. In my constituency, I have Prestwick Airport, which is the oldest passenger airport in Scotland, and we aren't even connected to London. There was a time where you could fly transatlantic, and we're now not. Do you not accept, does the honourable gentleman not accept that there's the potential to actually grow the total amount of tourist visitors, as opposed to we would steal from the north of England?
Well, no, I agree with the honourable lady, but if where air passenger duty is zero in Scotland and its current rates in lots of Newcastle, quite clearly they'll have an advantage. Scotland will have an advantage, which we will not. I don't want to get on to the amount that, for example, Scotland is able to devote to its tourism promotional budgets, which is another thing which clearly in the North East we need more to do that.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, because he seems to be setting out the most attractive form of tax competition, that if Scotland gets rid of APD, there'll be real pressure on the Chancellor to abolish it for the rest of the United Kingdom, and we will grow the whole... Marvellous to see the whole House moving in such a right-wing direction in its economic debates.
Well, no, actually, I would actually agree, for very rare occasions, agree with you. I would actually abolish APD altogether, because I think it's a tax which clearly the Scottish Government have recognised stifles economic development and is stifling development in the rest of the country. The PwC report says that, for example, I think 7% of overseas visitors would grow if we actually abolished it altogether, and it would actually bring in more from other taxes than it would actually get from APD. So I think, yes, there is a very strong case, I think, for actually abolishing it altogether. But what we're going to be left in a situation is where Scotland, quite rightly for their own reasons, and quite sensible reasons, will abolish it, or half it and then abolish it. It will leave, for example, Newcastle at a very disadvantage, and that will cost jobs. It's been anticipated that up to 1,000 jobs could be lost by 2025 if the situation remained the same, and loss of some gross £400 million gross value to the North East economy. And coming from the region which is, as I say, one of the poorest in the UK, we can't afford to actually be at that type of disadvantage. Now, as my friend before, Blakely and Broughton, said, there seems a bit of confusion over the government's approach to this, because as he read out the comment from the Chancellor at the Treasury Select Committee, he seemed to be quite sanguine in the fact that if we actually had this change in terms of allowing Scotland to reduce its APD, that a place like Newcastle would quite happily soak up a 10% loss in terms of its traffic. Well, I'm sorry, having been a director of the airport and knowing the airport management team very well as I do, I know how hard they have to work to attract every single flight a new route to Newcastle, and a clear 10% loss couldn't be accepted. But I think it also gives the game away, because my own friend didn't also mention the other point, is that it is the Chancellor's position, he said, and I quote him directly from the committee in response to a question he was asked. It said, and this is the Chancellor speaking, my personal view is that tax competition is something that we should be allowable. But if that means that we're going to be at a disadvantage in the North East, that is something which the government has got to address. Now, there is, again, some confusion over this, because during the general election, the Prime Minister was asked about unfair competition, both of Newcastle and, don't forget, the other airport in the North East, Durham Tees Valley. And the Prime Minister was questioned by a local newspaper about lower rates of APD for North East airports to match that in Scotland, which has been pressed by the Labour Party in the region, which he suggested could be a positive suggestion. What we need now, Mr Corsby, I would argue, is clear action. Now, we have a new Minister for the Northern Powerhouse, the member for Stockton South, whose constituency actually includes Durham Tees Valley, I understand. Now, it's a very interesting test of his power to see whether he can actually persuade the Treasury to do something about this effect, which will have effect on the North East economy. Now, we hear a lot about the Northern Powerhouse. Others in the North East seem to think it finishes in Manchester. And I think it would be important that this is addressed, because if it's not addressed, Mr Corsby, we are going to have a situation whereby this unfair tax will not only cost jobs in one of the poorest regions in the UK, but it will also stifle one of the few economic drivers we have in the North East, Newcastle Airport, which could not only grow business but also competition. Because the one thing, as I said in an intervention earlier on, which has not only driven passengers, but it's also driven cargo revenues. So it does actually have an effect in terms of the ability of North East companies to export around the world. And certainly the direct flight to Dubai has grown a lot of local businesses have been able to export products directly from the North East. So I'll be very interested to know what the government's approach to this is going to be. If this goes through, we cannot have a lag where it will leave regions such as the North East being hit by the tax competition, which the Chancellor seems to think is quite acceptable, and clearly the Prime Minister wants to do something about it. The ball now, I think, is firmly in the government's court to actually make sure that this anomaly is actually put right.
Alex Salmond.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm grateful to the honourable members for Blakely and Broughton and North Durham and the way they've spoken about the issue. I should say I'm slightly unconvinced by the argument that they had to table an amendment deleting the devolution of APD in order to make speeches. I mean, the speeches were available to be made in clause stand part. But nonetheless, whatever the reason, whatever the flow of logic is, I'm delighted that they have confirmed this evening that they support the devolution of air passenger duty. I'm going to be very supportive in return for some of the arguments that they've been making. But I thought it would be useful, since I've been through this in one guise and another over the last few years, just to remind the House of a little bit of history. The devolution of APD, air passenger duty, was proposed by the Coleman Commission. The Coleman Commission, for those of us who are not in the House or not fully up on these things, was the response of the unionist parties to the SNP breakthrough in the 2007 election. But we're here still debating it because it disappeared from the legislative programme which was enacted in the last Parliament. So air passenger duty has been proposed for devolution again by the Smith Commission, which was the response of unionist parties to the vow to try and deflect the Yes campaign in the final days of last year's referendum. Both of these things, incidentally, have been overtaken by the 56 members of Parliament who now adorn these benches for the Scottish National Party. And no doubt at some future occasion, and not too distant future, we'll be back debating what the government's response to that latest political development is. But surely history would tell us, and I think the honourable member for Blakely and Broughton referred to it, that it might have been far better to be more extensive, more generous with the devolution in the first place, rather than have to keep repeating some of the government's mistakes and Unionist parties' mistakes from the past. I'm interested in this argument in particular. I had a meeting with Howard Davis a few years back, when Howard Davis was set up to chair the Commission, which I think I'll be generous to say was to address the undercapacity, the congestion at south east of England airports. Perhaps was to bash Boris's proposal for an island airport, but was to reconcile between Heathrow and Gatwick. Now, two things we can absolutely be certain about the Howard Davis Commission and its state of proposals which are coming forward. The first thing we can be certain is whatever happens, whatever the final adjudication is, whatever the final decision is, it's going to be some considerable time before either Heathrow or Gatwick will emerge as the winner from the process. And the second thing we can say is that whatever emerges from the process, there will be considerable amounts of public money running into many billions of pounds by one means or another devoted to expanding the capacity of these airports, which are severely congested at the present moment. Now, the reason I mention it is when I had my meeting as First Minister with Mr Davis, or maybe Sir Howard Davis for all I know now, but it's Sir Howard Davis. I had my meeting with Sir Howard Davis. Well, it's soon to be ennobled, I'm told, but other people have more information on these things than I do. But when I had my meeting with Sir Howard, I said, look, given that whatever happens, your proposals are going to take some time to be enacted, wouldn't it be a grand idea if you were to propose in the meantime to relieve some of the congestion at the south of England airports, perhaps to reduce air passenger duty in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in the north of England, and pro tem at least, by diverting some of the business away, relieve some of that extraordinary pressure on the south of England airports. Therefore, I was very disappointed in his interim report when Sir Howard decided that such a thing would be a distortion of competition. And I thought it was a magnificent argument in its way, and magnificent in terms of the brass neck, that clearly it's not a distortion of competition to propose the expenditure of billions of pounds of public money financed by all of us to invest in increasing the capacity of the South England airports, but it would be a distortion of the competition to reduce the taxation and increase the revenues which were generated by airports in the north of England and Scotland and Northern Ireland. I give away gladly.
But would you agree with me that where we're losing business to, both in Scotland and North East and elsewhere, isn't necessarily just London, but is actually in mainland Europe, Schiphol and other areas where the air passenger duty has been abolished in some cases.
Yes, I do agree with that. But where I think we have to face the argument was the motivation for the introduction of what seems a remarkably foolish tax in the first place. Because any Chancellor looking at the situation at Heathrow, for example, would see a fully congested airport and an air passenger duty which has an effective collection rate of 100%. Whereas any Chancellor who was looking at the north of England or Northern Ireland or Scotland would see airports with substantial capacity where the reduction of APD could increase the business, and because not just of the increased business if it was a lower rate, but obviously of the increased revenues for VAT and other taxation, could actually see that magic formula of a Laffer curve emerging in the, I was going to turn to the Royal Young Gentleman. I mentioned a Laffer curve and he was busy in a conversation just when he could have reached a peak of excitement, but it looks like a tax where we can actually get a Laffer curve of reducing the tax and increasing the revenue, and that seems to be a view which is generally shared across the House. I give way.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman of Kibbing Way. Does he not accept that the vast majority of the investment, whether Heathrow or Gatwick, is accepted by the Davis Commission, will be private sector investment? It won't be billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. And does he also recognise that there's been a campaign from the aviation industry to abolish APD altogether because the Treasury has got itself hooked in this tax because it's worth £2.3 billion a year?
Well, on the first point, I only agree with it to the extent of those who argue that nuclear power would be something that would be done without the investment of public money. I think the honourable gentleman will find, as these proposals proceed, there will be substantial amounts of public money invested in that infrastructure in order to make it viable and credible. And if I could just turn to a survey, I don't have the exact figures with me, but if the House allows me, it does illustrate the comparison. A recent study was done about transport infrastructure spending per head in various parts of England. The figure for the south of east of England was over £2,000 per head. The figure for the north east of England, it was £26 per head. The north west of England was £200 per head. I think I've got the relative parameters just about right, but please inform me otherwise.
The honourable gentleman has got them in the right direction, but they're even more distorted than that. If the honourable gentleman looks at the capital expenditure figures, it's over 90% in London and the South East, compared to single-figure percentages in Yorkshire and Humberside and the North East.
Knowingly undersold, so therefore I shall say to the honourable gentleman that I accept his figures. I was trying to moderate them slightly, just in case the House found them incredible. But it does tell us where we should be turning to in terms of distortion of competition. I'm delighted that the honourable members from the north of England have accepted that this tax should be devolved. I'm delighted that they've accepted the economic argument behind the way the Scottish Government is moving. I think this tax should be reduced in the north of England airports as well, because there is substantial capacity which is there and available, which should increase the revenue for us all. But I do think, and I'm glad that the amendment didn't become the basis of this conversation, because if all of us in this situation, if we'd looked in the Scottish Government at Northern Ireland and opposed the devolution of part of APD to Northern Ireland, then we would have had a situation where no progress would have been made. We're now in a position where we're on the brink, the verge of having APD devolved to Scotland. And I would say to the members in the north of England, take the attitude that this should be the example for further devolution, for a sensible policy which doesn't just benefit one part of the country but looks at the economic opportunities in all parts of the country. So therefore I hope when the Minister replies that, because I came in for this debate and it was unfortunate enough just to catch the end of the VAT fiddle debate, and I do hope when he does reply to this particular aspect, he will get back to that usual style of grace and imagination which he so adorns the dispatch box, instead of that wholly disappointing and negative attitude to the embezzlement of VAT from the Scottish Police Service, but this time recognises the opportunity for Scotland and indeed for the north of England of making sure that this disgraceful tax is reduced and economic activity is increased.
Rob Morris.
Well, I have to say to the committee, I don't share this cosy consensus. The honourable member for Dundee East made it very clear in his usual honourable way, and I've sparred with him many times, as he knows, that if APD be devolved, then the Scottish Government, if controlled by the SNP, will cut APD markedly and has a goal of abolishing it. He helped the committee by quoting the Prime Minister, words to the effect that there would be, and these are my words, not the Prime Minister's, a beggar my neighbour downwards on APD. Well, call me old-fashioned, Mr Corsby. I think environmental laws should be statewide and should be international. And APD, to me, and that's why I voted for it years ago, is an environmental law. And again, the SNP have been, as ever, totally open with the House. They want to see the number of airline passengers increase throughout the United Kingdom. That is... No, I will not. That is an environmental step backwards. I will in a moment. That is an environmental step backwards. Environmental laws, we have them internationally, fortunately, through the European Union, for example, on waste disposal, or on air quality, something of which, of course, the United Kingdom is, to coin a phrase, falling foul at the moment. I give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. Does he want to increase the rate of APD following his argument, or is he saying that the Tories have got it at just the right rate?
I would increase the rate of APD, yes, I would. I was also a member of this House, and there are several members present, a minority, when the Climate Change Act was debated as the Climate Change Bill. And there is in that Act a target, which my recollection, I stand to be corrected, is UK-wide, for an 80% cut in the United Kingdom's CO2 emissions by 2050. I did not vote for that because I thought it was, to coin a phrase, hot air, and sadly, in the years since that Act has been passed, and we see it tonight, I was right. I give way.
The honourable gentleman is not correct. Climate change legislation is devolved, and the Scottish Parliament have its own act where the targets are even more ambitious and well on the way to being met.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for that. Could he perhaps inform the committee, if he chose to intervene on me again, how on earth the Scotland and the Scotland Parliament are going to meet those figures if they're intent on increasing the number of airline passengers?
Because, as indeed one of his honourable friends alluded to, one direct flight is better than two indirect flights to airports.
Well, the right honourable member will know that the whole history hitherto of airline travel has been that it increases exponentially. It has done so, and if allowed to do so, will continue. So I don't share this cosy consensus. I'm not part of the airline and airport love-ins. Already, members will know, honourable members will know, already the airlines and their passengers get a huge subsidy because of the low price of airline fuel, kerosene, that they pay. And honourable members ought to bear in mind when they're debating airline passenger duty, and no doubt the figures are lower in Scotland, but across the United Kingdom in any given year, half the population do not fly. And I suspect that honourable members themselves have a completely distorted view, because I suspect that I am one of the very few members of this House who never flies. I haven't flown for years. And I suspect that just about every other member in this debate and just about every other member in this House has a distorted view, and it is self-interest. It is self-interest. It is not me who, through airline flying, is causing a huge amount of environmental degradation, because the emissions of greenhouse gases by aeroplanes at high altitude are far more damaging than the emissions of a likewise amount of greenhouse gases at sea level. And airlines are the most polluting form of mass travel. And I regret that the government, in this context, is devolving air passenger duty. Yes, I would increase it, and the UK government will live to regret this, because the abolition, as we're clearly heading towards, of air passenger duty, both in Scotland and eventually through a beggar my neighbour downwards across the rest of the United Kingdom, another nail in the coffin of the doomed and uneconomic HS2 railway line, because people will continue to fly from Scotland and the north of England south and vice versa, and will not be taking an HS2 line. It's already uneconomic, and with the abolition of air passenger duty, it will become even more uneconomic.
Ian Murray.
Mr Cosby, I won't detain the House, but let me just pose a few questions on the basis of the issues that are being discussed, air passenger duty and the aggregates levy. Let me start with air passenger duty. Prior to the election, the opposition had written to the Chancellor to ask what the impact would be, not just on regional English airports, but indeed on Scottish airports, if in the future air passenger duty was higher in Scotland as it was in England. And just wanted to hear from the Minister about what the government's movements were on that kind of impact assessment. The second thing is, and I know members were berating the member for Wolverhampton South West, but he raises an incredibly important environmental issue. And it's an issue that has been raised directly by the Committee on Climate Change, who reported recently that Scotland missed its climate change targets by 4.5% for the third time in a row, and asks the Scottish Government to assess the impact of carbon in the economy with regard to air passenger duty. Now, I can't ask the Scottish Government directly from this dispatch box, but I wonder if the environmental impact assessment has also been done with regards to whether or not air passenger duty goes down or up. And finally, with regards to the aggregates levy, I wonder if the Minister, in his brief summing up, could tell us how the progress of the state aid issues and the legalities around the state aid issues are being resolved, and when we would expect to see the aggregates levy devolved to the Scottish Parliament.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Crosbie. And we've had a reasonably lengthy debate that, for the most part, has not tended to differ on the substance of the APD clause in front of us, although the honourable member for Wolverhampton South West is never short of, never afraid of setting out a contrary opinion. In fact, I noticed from the party opposite, from the backbenchers, we heard both the argument for the abolition of APD, which would cost something in the region of £3.2 billion, and the argument for increasing APD. Well, if there's a need for fresh thinking from the party opposite, we're hearing plenty of it this evening, even if not too much by way of coherence. But I'll certainly wait in
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He's right, obviously, about the revenue from air passenger duty. But is he aware that there have been a number of studies, and the most significant one is the Price Waterhouse study, which shows that there would be an economic benefit to the country greater than that 2.3 billion if APD was abolished?
Well, I am aware of those studies, and although I won't detain the House for long on this subject, we don't agree with the conclusions of the PwC study that the benefits would not be as significant as PwC have suggested. But if I can just turn to the issue that was raised by the honourable gentleman, indeed his honourable friend, the member for North Durham, in terms of the impact on regional airports of the devolution of APD to Scotland. Let me just make the point that we recognise the potential impacts here, and the government is reviewing options for supporting regional airports from the effects of devolution, and we will be publishing a discussion paper on this later in the summer. And I think this document will address many of the concerns raised during the debate today by the honourable gentleman. And I will ensure that the document is available to members of this House. I'll certainly give way to the honourable gentleman.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. Can he see any advantages in other tax revenues from the cutting of APD, or does he think that the countries that have cut APD have done this from lemming-like behaviour?
Well, there are arguments and there are different views as to the economic impact of cutting APD. The point is here that we are legislating, and I'm sure that the honourable gentleman will be supporting this legislation. We're legislating to devolve this to Scotland. That is also part of the Smith Commission arrangements and so on. It does have potentially knock-on effects in terms of regional airports that in particular are close to the Scottish border, and as I say, we are reviewing our options there, and we'll report later in the summer on that. I'll certainly give way to the honourable gentleman.
One of the advantages of the reduction in air passenger duty that we've been able to achieve in Northern Ireland was the main flight between Belfast, Aldergrove and the New York City. A flight that's well used, it's utilised, it's created a power in Aldergrove, but it's also connected to the United States and Northern Ireland. I can do more, and just an example of that in Northern Ireland, and one place and one flight could be replicated across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Again, the honourable gentleman is making a particular case. I think there are particular circumstances in respect of that flight to the US, and particularly given the competition that existed from the Republic of Ireland, which is why steps were taken on that particular point. But as I say, we will be setting out options, but I'll certainly give way to the honourable gentleman.
So is the Minister telling the House tonight that the Chancellor has changed his views? Because clearly when he went before the Treasury Select Committee last year, when he talked about the effects on Newcastle, which he said would be around 10%, he said that work was carried out a couple of years ago, but in Newcastle's case, its traffic went up last year by 12%, so I think it is manageable. So is he actually giving a commitment now that this is actually going to be looked at, or does he actually think, is the Chancellor still sticking his own position is that reduction of 10% would be acceptable and manageable, in his own words, when he went before the Select Committee for Newcastle.